The ballroom glittered under a cascade of crystal chandeliers, their light fracturing into 1,000 golden sparks across the polished marble floor. The scent of champagne and fresh orchids hung heavy in the air, mingling with the soft hum of a string quartet and the laughter of Manhattan's elite. It was a charity gala for the ages, a night to raise millions for children's hospitals. At its heart was Donald Trump, his presence as commanding as ever, his voice booming with charm as he worked the crowd. Then, at 9:47 p.m., he vanished. For 20 long minutes, the man who owned every room he entered was gone. No trace, no explanation. Security scanned the exits, their earpieces crackling with urgency. Guests whispered, their eyes darting to the empty space where he'd stood moments before. Where was he? What could pull him away from the spotlight? When he returned, his tie slightly askew, a faint smile playing on his lips, the truth was unimaginable. And when it broke, the room erupted in applause that shook the walls. The Grand Meridian Hotel was a relic of old New York, its walls steeped in history, its corridors lined with velvet drapes the color of a midnight sky. The ballroom was a spectacle, towering floral arrangements in shades of ivory and blush, tables draped in silk, and waiters gliding silently with trays of gold-flecked desserts. The gala was a magnet for the city's power players, senators, CEOs, actors, and philanthropists, all gathered to support children's hospitals across the state. Trump was the evening's linchpin, his name on the invitation tripling the turnout. He'd arrived in a tailored navy suit, his hair catching the light like a crown, his handshake firm as he moved through the crowd with a grin that said he owned the night. His opening speech had been classic Trump, bold, brash, with just enough humor to keep the room captivated. "These kids," he'd said, pausing for effect, "they're fighters. Tougher than most of us in this room. We're here to give them a chance to keep fighting." The crowd had applauded, assuming it was just rhetoric. But those closest to him noticed something, a fleeting softness in his eyes, a crack in the polished facade. He'd been quieter than usual before the event, his usual flurry of phone calls replaced by moments of stillness, his gaze lingering on a folded letter he kept in his breast pocket. As the night unfolded, the ballroom pulsed with energy. The quartet played Vivaldi, their notes weaving through the clink of glasses and the murmur of deals being struck over caviar. Trump was in his element, holding court with a group of donors, his laughter booming as he recounted a story about outsmarting a rival in a real estate deal. "It's all about timing," he said, winking at a young heiress who blushed under his attention. Then, mid-sentence, he paused. A young woman in a staff apron approached, her dark hair pulled back tightly, her hands twisting nervously. "Mr. Trump," she whispered, barely audible over the music, "I need to speak with you. It's urgent." He raised an eyebrow, his instinct to brush her off warring with the earnestness in her eyes. 5 minutes, he said, glancing at his watch. "Make it quick." He excused himself from the group, flashing a grin to mask the oddity of the moment, and followed her through a side door into a dimly lit hallway. The crowd barely noticed at first, too caught up in their own conversations. But as minutes ticked by, 5, 10, 15, the absence of his larger-than-life presence created a void. A senator leaned toward his wife, muttering, "Where'd he go?" A journalist scribbled furiously, sensing a scoop. Security guards exchanged tense glances, their hands hovering over their radios. The air grew thick with unease, the kind that settles when a room's gravity shifts. In the labyrinth of service corridors, the sounds of the gala faded to a distant hum. The young woman, Clara, led him with purpose, her steps quick despite the tremble in her hands. The air smelled faintly of cleaning polish and old wood, the walls lined with faded photographs of the hotel's glory days. "This way, sir," she said, her voice steady now. "She's waiting." Trump's brow furrowed. But he followed, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood. They reached a small, unassuming room at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. Clara pushed it open, revealing a girl, no older than 10, sitting in an oversized armchair. She wore a hospital gown, a colorful scarf wrapped around her bald head. Her name was Lily, and her eyes, bright despite the shadows beneath them, lit up when she saw him. "You came," she said, her voice a fragile thread, barely carrying across the room. Trump froze, his usual swagger dissolving. He glanced at Clara, then back at Lily, his mind racing to piece together the moment. "Of course I came, kid," he said finally, his tone softer than anyone in the ballroom would have recognized. "Heard you're a big fan." He stepped inside, letting the door close behind him, shutting out the world. Lily was a patient at one of the hospitals the Gala was supporting. Months earlier, she'd written him a letter, her handwriting shaky but determined. "You never give up," she'd scrawled. "You fight for what you want. I'm fighting too, but it's hard. I want to be like you." The letter had arrived at his office by chance, buried in a pile of fan mail. Most would have been skimmed and discarded, but this one stopped him cold. He'd read it twice, then tucked it into his pocket, carrying it with him for weeks. When Clara, Lily's older sister and a volunteer at the hospital, learned he'd be at the gala, she'd taken a gamble. She tracked him down, her heart pounding, and asked for a moment of his time, not for herself, but for Lily, who'd been too weak to attend the event but had been brought to the hotel by a nurse for this one chance. In that small room, time seemed to stretch. The walls were plain, the air faintly sterile, but the space felt alive with something unspoken. Trump pulled a chair close to Lily, his towering frame folding into the moment. She told him about her treatments, her voice wavering but her spirit fierce. She dreamed of being a painter, of filling canvases with colors so bright they'd make people smile. "I'm gonna make a masterpiece one day," she said, her hands clutching the arms of the chair. "You already are," he replied, leaning forward, his voice low and earnest. "You're tougher than anyone out there in that fancy ballroom." Lily giggled, a sound like wind chimes in the quiet. Then she grew serious, her eyes searching his. "Do you ever get scared?" The question hit like a freight train. The world saw him as unshakable, a man who thrived on chaos and emerged unscathed. But here in this room, with no cameras or crowds, he let the mask slip. "Sure I do," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone does. But you know what? Scared's just a signal. Means you're alive. Means you're fighting. And you, kid, you're fighting harder than most." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small gold pin, a replica of the one on his lapel. "This is for you," he said, pressing it into her hand. "A little something to remind you you're a champ." Lily's smile was brighter than the chandeliers, brighter than anything in that gilded ballroom. Clara, standing by the door, white tears from her cheeks, her breath catching as she watched. The 20 minutes passed unnoticed, a fleeting eternity in a world that demanded his presence elsewhere. When he stood to leave, Lily grabbed his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, unable to find words, and stepped back into the corridor, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. When he re-entered the ballroom, the crowd's eyes locked onto him. His tie was slightly crooked, his hair a fraction less perfect, but his stride was steady. He offered no explanation, only a quick nod to the event organizer before slipping back into the rhythm of the night. The tension dissolved, the gala rolling on as if nothing had happened. It wasn't until the closing remarks that the truth spilled out. Clara, her voice trembling but resolute, took the microphone. She told the story of Lily, her little sister, and the man who'd given her 20 minutes of his time, 20 minutes that lit up a little girl's world. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Then, as one, the guests rose, their applause thundering through the hall, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the hotel. Trump stood at the back, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a quiet pride, a flicker of something real. As the lights dimmed and the guests drifted into the night, the echo of that applause carried a truth that lingered. Sometimes, the true strength of a leader isn't in the grand gestures or the spotlight's glare, but in the quiet acts no one sees. In a world that demands spectacle, it's the unseen moments, the ones that happen in small rooms, away from the cameras, that define who we are. Trump's 20 minutes weren't for fame or headlines. They were for Lily, a girl whose courage matched his own. And that was enough. Sometimes, true strength shines brightest in the shadows, where no one is watching.